A millionaire abandons his wife and son. Years later, his own DNA test destroys his life. In the bustling city of Millfield, Jonathan Blake's name was synonymous with power and influence. A self-made millionaire, he had built an empire on ruthless business tactics and a complete disregard for those around him. Jonathan reveled in his ability to manipulate others, believing his wealth made him untouchable. But his cruelty knew no bounds when it came to his family. Years ago, he had abandoned his wife Claire and their young son Noah, leaving them to fend for themselves while he indulged in a life of excess and luxury. Claire, once a vibrant young woman, now struggled to make ends meet, working long hours at a local diner to support her son. Unbeknownst to Jonathan, Claire had a past she kept hidden, even from those closest to her. Before her marriage, she had been part of a secret society, one dedicated to justice and equality. Her mentor, a mysterious figure known only as the Guardian, had taken Claire under her wing, training her in the ways of the society. Claire had left that life behind when she fell in love with Jonathan, believing she could find happiness in a normal life. But as she watched her husband's cruelty and selfishness destroy their family, Claire began to question her choices. Miles away, in a nondescript apartment, a woman named Evelyn sat at her computer, her eyes scanning lines of code. Evelyn was a hacker, one of the best in the business, but her skills were not for sale. Instead, she used her abilities to expose corruption and bring justice to those who believed themselves above the law. A message popped up on her screen, encrypted and untraceable. It was from the Guardian, requesting her immediate presence. Evelyn knew the summons must be urgent, for the Guardian rarely reached out directly. She quickly packed a bag and left her apartment, making her way through the city streets with practiced ease. Finally, she arrived at an old warehouse near the docks. Inside, she found the Guardian waiting. Evelyn, the Guardian greeted her warmly. "Thank you for coming so quickly. What's going on?" Evelyn asked, sensing the tension in her mentor's voice. "It's about Claire," the Guardian said softly. "She needs our help." Claire stood at the kitchen sink, washing dishes as tears streamed down her face. She had just received another overdue notice for their rent, and she knew there was no way she could come up with the money in time. Noah sat at the table, his homework spread before him, blissfully unaware of his mother's turmoil. A knock at the door startled Claire from her thoughts. She quickly wiped her eyes and went to answer it, wondering who could be visiting at this hour. To her surprise, she found Evelyn and the Guardian standing on her doorstep. Claire's eyes widened in recognition as she ushered them inside quickly. "What are you doing here?" she whispered urgently as Noah looked up curiously. "We know about Jonathan," the Guardian said gently. "We want to help." Claire shook her head. "I can't go back to that life," she said. "I have Noah to think about now." Evelyn placed a comforting hand on Claire's shoulder. "You don't have to do this alone," she said softly. "Let us help you." Jonathan sat in his penthouse office, a glass of expensive scotch in hand, staring out at the city below. He had just closed another lucrative deal, crushing a smaller competitor with ease. His phone buzzed with an incoming text message. It was from his latest mistress, a young model he had been seeing on the side. She was demanding more money, threatening to go public with their affair if he didn't comply. Jonathan scoffed, deleting the message without a second thought. Women were always so predictable. They all wanted the same thing, his money. And as long as he had that, he could have any woman he wanted. The intercom on his desk crackled to life, and his secretary's voice filled the room. "Mr. Blake, there's someone here to see you." Jonathan frowned in annoyance. "I'm busy," he snapped. "Tell them to make an appointment." But his secretary's next words made his blood run cold. "Sir, it's the police. They say it's urgent." Claire sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a steaming mug of tea. Evelyn sat across from her, with the Guardian standing watchfully nearby. Noah had been sent to bed, his questions about the mysterious visitors gently deflected. Evelyn leaned forward, her eyes filled with compassion. "Claire, I know this must be difficult for you," she said softly. But we're here because we believe Jonathan's actions have gone unchecked for too long. Claire nodded, her eyes filled with pain. He's hurt so many people, she whispered. Not just me and Noah, but his employees, his business partners, anyone who gets in his way. The guardian stepped forward, her voice firm. It's time for him to face the consequences of his actions, she said. And we're going to make sure that happens. Claire looked up at her former mentor, a glimmer of hope in her eyes. How? She asked. Evelyn grinned, her fingers tapping lightly on the laptop in front of her. We have a plan, she said confidently. And it starts with exposing Jonathan's darkest secrets. The police officers who arrived at Jonathan's office were not there to arrest him. Instead, they handed him a thick envelope, their faces grim. You've been served, one of the officers said, handing over the paperwork. This is a court summons. You're being sued for fraud, embezzlement, and a host of other charges. Jonathan stared at the papers in disbelief, his mind reeling. How could this be happening? He had been so careful, so meticulous in covering his tracks. As the officers left, Jonathan sank into his chair, his hand shaking as he poured himself another drink. He knew he needed to act fast, to call his lawyers and start damage control. But for the first time in his life, he felt a flicker of fear. Meanwhile, across town, Evelyn and the Guardian were hard at work. They had spent hours combing through Jonathan's financial records, hacking into his offshore accounts, and uncovering a web of illegal activity. Armed with this evidence, they began reaching out to Jonathan's victims, the employees he had underpaid and overworked, the small business owners he had driven into bankruptcy, the women he had used and discarded. One by one, they told their stories, their voices shaking with anger and pain. And as the evidence mounted, it became clear that Jonathan's downfall was only a matter of time. Noah sat on the edge of his bed, his mind racing. He had overheard snippets of his mother's conversation with the mysterious visitors, and he knew something big was happening. At 12 years old, Noah was wise beyond his years. He had seen the toll his father's abandonment had taken on his mother, the way she struggled to keep a roof over their heads and food on the table. He had also seen the way the other kids at school looked at him, whispering behind his back about his deadbeat dad. Noah knew he was different from his classmates, that his family wasn't like theirs. But as he listened to his mother's hushed voice, heard the determination in her tone, he felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, things were about to change. Quietly, he crept out of bed and made his way to the kitchen. His mother was still sitting at the table with Evelyn and the Guardian, their heads bent together in deep discussion. "Mom," he said softly, causing all three women to look up in surprise. Claire quickly stood and made her way over to her son. "Noah, honey, what are you doing up?" she asked gently. Noah looked past her to Evelyn and the Guardian. "I want to help," he said firmly. "I know Dad did something bad. I want to make it right." Jonathan's lawyers were some of the best in the business, but even they were struggling to keep up with the barrage of evidence Evelyn and the Guardian had uncovered. They shuffled the papers on the conference room table, their brows furrowed in concentration. Jonathan sat at the head of the table, his shoulders slumped and his eyes bloodshot. "This doesn't look good," one of the lawyers said finally, rubbing his temples. "They have bank records, witness statements, email trails. It's a solid case." Jonathan slammed his fist on the table, causing everyone to jump. "I don't care how solid it is," he roared. "I pay you to make this go away, not tell me how bad it looks." The lawyers exchanged wary glances, then turned back to their papers. They knew they were fighting an uphill battle, but none of them were willing to risk Jonathan's wrath by admitting defeat. As they worked, Jonathan's phone buzzed with an incoming message. He glanced down at the screen and froze, his face draining of color. It was a blurry photo, taken from a distance, but there was no mistaking the woman in the picture. It was Claire, standing outside the diner where she worked, deep in conversation with a hooded figure. The message below read simply, "We know what you did, Jonathan. And we're coming for you." The Guardian sat in a dimly lit room, surrounded by computer screens and high-tech equipment. Her eyes scanned the data streaming across the monitors, searching for the final piece of the puzzle. For years, she had been tracking Jonathan's movements, watching as he built his empire on the backs of the vulnerable and the powerless. She had seen the trail of destruction he left in his wake, the lives he had ruined without a second thought. But now, thanks to Evelyn and Claire, she finally had the evidence she needed to bring him down. The only thing left was to connect the dots, to find the smoking gun that would seal his fate. As she worked, a message popped up on one of the screens. It was from Noah, using the secure messaging app Evelyn had installed on his phone. "I found something," the message read, followed by a series of photos. The Guardian's eyes widened as she clicked through them, her heart racing. There, in grainy black and white, was Jonathan, caught on a security camera outside a seedy motel. And next to him, her face partially obscured by a scarf, was a woman who was definitely not Claire. The Guardian sat back in her chair, a slow smile spreading across her face. This was it, the final nail in Jonathan's coffin. And she knew just how to use it. Claire stood outside the diner, her apron still tied around her waist, watching as the sun began to set over the city. She had just finished a long shift, her feet aching and her mind exhausted. But as she thought back on the events of the last few days, she felt a sense of hope rising within her. For the first time in years, she felt like she had a chance to build a better life for herself and her son, free from Jonathan's shadow. She thought of Evelyn and the Guardian, of the risks they were taking to help her. She thought of Noah, so brave and determined, ready to stand up to his father despite his young age. And she thought of her own past, of the life she had left behind to be with Jonathan. She had been so naive then, so blinded by love that she had ignored all the warning signs. But now, with the support of her friends and the strength of her own convictions, she knew she could face whatever lay ahead. She took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and began the long walk home, ready for whatever tomorrow might bring. As she walked, a hooded figure watched from the shadows, her eyes glinting with satisfaction. The Guardian had been right, Claire was a force to be reckoned with. And together, they would bring Jonathan to his knees. Jonathan sat in his office, his head in his hands, surrounded by a sea of paperwork. The lawsuit was bad enough, but the media had caught wind of the allegations against him, and now his face was plastered across every newspaper and news channel in the country. His phone buzzed with incoming messages and emails, each one more urgent than the last. His investors were pulling out, his business partners were cutting ties, and even his most loyal employees were jumping ship. He had always prided himself on his ability to control the narrative, to spin any situation to his advantage. But this time, he was powerless to stop the avalanche of bad press and public outrage. As he sat there, drowning in his own despair, a knock sounded at the door. He looked up, expecting to see another process server or angry creditor. But instead, he found himself face to face with a ghost from his past, a woman he had never expected to see again. "Hello, Jonathan," the Guardian said, her voice cold and hard as steel. "It's time we had a little chat." Claire sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by a group of women she had never met before. They were all victims of Jonathan's cruelty, all with stories of pain and suffering that broke her heart. There was Maria, a single mother who had worked as Jonathan's housekeeper for years, enduring his constant verbal abuse and sexual harassment. There was Tanya, a brilliant young executive who had been passed over for promotion time and time again, simply because she refused to play by Jonathan's rules. And there were countless others, each with their own tale of heartache and betrayal. As they spoke, Claire felt a sense of solidarity growing within her, a sense of shared purpose and determination. Together, they began to plan their next move. They would not rest until Jonathan was held accountable for his actions, until he was forced to face the consequences of his cruelty. As the meeting drew to a close, Claire hugged each woman in turn, feeling a sense of connection she had never experienced before. She knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult, but with these women by her side, she felt ready for anything. And watching from the shadows, Evelyn and the Guardian nodded in approval. The pieces were falling into place, and soon, Jonathan would have nowhere left to hide. Jonathan stared at the piece of paper in his hand, his eyes wide with shock and disbelief. It was a DNA test, one that he had never even known existed. And there, in black and white, were the results he had never expected to see. Noah, the son he had abandoned all those years ago, was not his biological child. The guardian watched him closely, her eyes glinting with satisfaction. She had known the truth for years, had been holding onto this piece of information like a trump card, waiting for the right moment to play it. How? Jonathan stammered, his voice shaking. How did you? The guardian smiled, a cold, cruel smile. I have my ways, she said simply. And now, the whole world will know the truth about you, Jonathan. The truth about the man you really are. Jonathan's mind raced, trying to make sense of this new information. If Noah wasn't his son, then who was the father? And why had Claire never told him? As if reading his mind, the guardian spoke again. Claire was pregnant when she met you, she said. The father was a good man, a kind man. But you swept in with your money and your charm, and she fell for you. She thought you could give her the life she wanted. Jonathan's heart sank as the realization hit him. He had stolen Claire away from a good man, had destroyed her life and her child's life, all for his own selfish gain. And now, with the truth exposed, he knew there was no way back. His life, his empire, everything he had built, was crumbling around him like a house of cards. The guardian set the DNA test down on the desk, her work done. Goodbye, Jonathan, she said, turning to leave. I hope you enjoy your new reality. Claire stood on her front porch, surrounded by her friends and neighbors. The sun shone down on the little house, casting a warm glow on the little garden she had planted, the flowers just starting to bloom. Noah stood by her side, his hand in hers. He had grown so much in the last few months, had faced challenges no child should ever have to face. But he had emerged stronger, more resilient, ready to face whatever life might throw at him. Claire looked out at the faces of the people around her, the people who had stood by her side through thick and thin. Maria, the housekeeper who had finally found the courage to speak out against Jonathan's abuse. Tanya, the executive who had helped build the case against him, using her own experience as a guide. And Evelyn and the guardian, the two women who had started it all, who had believed in her even when she hadn't believed in herself. Together, they had brought Jonathan to justice. He was facing years in prison, his empire in ruins, his reputation destroyed. And while Claire knew there would be challenges ahead, she also knew she was not alone. She had her friends, her community, her own inner strength. She had a future, one filled with hope and promise. As she looked out at the little garden, at the flowers just starting to bloom, she felt a sense of peace wash over her. She knew that life was full of surprises, both good and bad. But with the love and support of those around her, she knew she could weather any storm. And so, with a smile on her face and her son by her side, Claire stepped forward into the sunlight, ready to embrace whatever the future might bring. In the weeks and months that followed, Claire's life underwent a transformation. With Jonathan behind bars and his assets seized, she suddenly found herself with a financial cushion she had never known before. For the first time, she could breathe easy, could focus on rebuilding her life without the constant fear of eviction or hunger. She quit her job at the diner and went back to school, determined to earn the degree she had always dreamed of. She volunteered at a local women's shelter, using her own experiences to help other women who had suffered at the hands of cruel and manipulative men. And through it all, she had Noah by her side, her constant companion and source of strength. He was thriving in school, making new friends and discovering new passions. He even started a club at school, one dedicated to promoting kindness and compassion among his classmates. Claire watched him with pride, marveling at the young man he was becoming. She knew that he would face challenges in life, just as she had. But she also knew that he had the resilience and the heart to overcome them, to build a life of purpose and meaning. As for Evelyn and the guardian, they continued their work in the shadows, using their skills and resources to bring justice to those who thought themselves above the law. They knew that their fight was far from over, that there would always be men like Jonathan who preyed on the vulnerable and the powerless. But they also knew that they had made a difference, that they had changed lives for the better. And that knowledge fueled them, drove them to keep fighting, to keep pushing for a world where everyone could live with dignity and respect. Months turned into years, and life went on. Claire graduated from college with honors, her son cheering her on from the front row. She started her own business, a small consulting firm that helped women navigate the challenges of the corporate world. Noah grew into a fine young man, kind and compassionate, with a fierce sense of justice. He followed in his mother's footsteps, using his privilege and his platform to fight for those who had been left behind. And through it all, the little house with the garden remained a constant, a reminder of the love and the strength that had brought them through the darkest of times. Claire would often sit on her porch swing, watching the sunset and thinking back on all that had happened. She thought of Jonathan, serving out his sentence in a federal prison, his empire reduced to ashes. She thought of the women she had met, the survivors who had become her friends and her sisters in arms. And she thought of the Guardian and Evelyn, the two women who had changed her life in ways she could never fully express. She knew that she owed them a debt she could never repay, a debt of gratitude and friendship that would last a lifetime. As the years passed, Claire's consulting firm grew and thrived, becoming a beacon of hope for women across the country. She spoke at conferences and events, sharing her story and her wisdom with all who would listen. And always, she carried with her the lessons she had learned, the truths that had been seared into her heart. That there was strength in unity, power in compassion. That even the darkest of times could lead to the brightest of futures if only one had the courage to keep moving forward. She watched her son grow into adulthood, marveling at the man he had become. And she knew that, whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, armed with the love and the resilience that had brought them this far. For Claire had learned the most important lesson of all, that true power came not from wealth or status, but from the connections we forge with others. That in the end, it was the love we gave and the lives we touched that mattered most. And so, as she sat on her porch swing, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Claire smiled. She knew that her story was far from over, that there were chapters yet to be written. But she also knew that, no matter what the future held, she would face it with courage and with hope. For she had seen the power of transformation, had felt the strength of a community united. And she knew that, together, there was nothing they could not overcome.